So I'm standing here in the Baviaanskloof on a slope that has been heavily degraded. There should be a closed canopy thicket. Shouldn't be able to walk through it. And it's been degraded by domestic livestock and more than a century of overbrowsing. This site is called Mission Impossible because for more than a decade they've been planting spekboom on it and it's been dying. We came to the site because we were looking for an area that we could test various protocols for planting spekboom for restoration purposes, and we were looking for areas that had very extreme abiotic factors, so a harsh environment, so we could really rapidly test which methods worked and which ones didn't. And so we fenced off a plot. There's the fenced area, and we planted a whole range of spekboom in different ways. What we've got here are rooted cuttings. So a rooted cutting is a fairly small part of the plant. You take maybe about that much, 30 centimeters, and you put that in soil, you root it, and you come and plant it out. That's very different from the unrooted truncheons, which has been the mainstay of spekboom restoration for more than 2 decades. And a truncheon, yeah, there we go, that looks like a good example of what a truncheon would look like, is a stem thicker than your thumb, and then the plant all above that. So usually they're about 50 to 70 centimeters, so a very large portion. You then cut that off and go stick it in the ground, unrooted, and let it root. So what we were experiencing in this plot is that we first went in May 2020 and planted a lot of unrooted truncheons up there. They all, we had high mortality, and so Rob Duker came up with the idea of let's put in rooted cuttings because they're well established. What we found is that the plants up there weren't rooting when we dug them up to try and figure out why they died. And so he came up with the idea of rooting cuttings and put them out here, and we had incredibly high survival rates, and these plants are looking fantastic. You know, getting up to a meter tall, but more importantly, the skirt is forming. This one's got a skirt that's almost a meter wide, which is looking fantastic. Here's another plant, also getting up to a meter. Not all of them are like that. Here's a slightly smaller one. There's a smaller one on that side as well. But in general, on average, they're getting up to a meter in height and forming a skirt that's getting onto between maybe 50 centimeters and a meter in diameter, which is very impressive. So for rooted cuttings, this was fantastic news that firstly we had such high survival and that they seem to be growing fairly well. It's important to remember that although many of them look great, there are a couple that just don't seem to be growing all that well, and that, you know, we're going to get this variation. It's important to remember that you're going to get a lot of variation in growth form and growth in the field. Crucially, these rooted cuttings are also developing a skirt, which is very important because that's what traps your sediment on these kind of slopes. So if we look in here, oh, we've got some grass growing in there because that's a nice moist sediment. You can see grass germinating, but you can see there's a lot of sediment there. You know, here it's come and trapped a whole stack of sediment, which must be about 2 to 3 centimeters higher than the bare soil around here. So this is where the magic is happening. It's creating its own little microclimate and soil and moisture trap, which is the crucial component of this. So these are the rooted cuttings. Let's go up the slope slightly further up to have a look at the unrooted truncheons and how they've done. And I'm up in this block that was planted with unrooted truncheons. You can see they're also getting up to about 1 meter in height. Their skirts are slightly more extensive and the bushes just look bushier. There's more volume to them than the rooted cuttings. And these were planted 5 months after those ones down there. So unrooted truncheons also seem to work, seem to grow just a little bit faster as well. But one needs to remember that this is the second time we planted this slope or this patch, because our first treatment that we did about a year beforehand, we had incredibly high mortality. And why was that? That was because we put the unrooted truncheons into the ground and then it didn't rain. It didn't rain for a long time and the truncheons weren't able to root. They need moisture in the soil to be able to have that root development. There was no root development, and so the truncheons just died. And however, when we put these ones in, there was rain shortly afterwards, and we had incredibly high survival and root development. And look at them now. So same slope, a year apart, two entirely different results. One was very high mortality, and the other was very high survival and subsequent growth. So why do we not just use unrooted truncheons the whole time? Is because we don't know when we're going to get those rainfall events. In the thicket here, we've got aseasonal or non-seasonal rainfall. We can get rain in winter, we can get rain in summer. More importantly, we can get long periods of time in summer or winter where we get no rain whatsoever. So we've got no predictable rainfall to schedule our planting by. And so that makes life very difficult if you're using unrooted truncheons, because we have a lot of long dry spells. So you can invest a lot in harvesting, putting it out in the veld, and it all dies. And so my suggestion is that you wait for large rainfall events, 15 mils or more, and when you've then got a short window where you've got high soil moisture, take your cuttings and put them into the ground. I know Yapi Buckle is having great success with that approach. So he's planting rooted cuttings when you've got dry soils, and then he switches to unrooted truncheons when you get a lot of rain. So that does seem to be an approach that does work, but it does mean that you are also waiting for these rainfall events. There's another crucial lesson that this site teaches us, and that is the role of herbivores in the success or failure of restoration. Up at the top of the site, we had the same batch that was planted here. The goats got in, and we lost most of the plants up the top there, but they didn't get down here before they were taken out, removed, thankfully. And then the other thing is, the slope was called Mission Impossible because it was believed that the environment was so harsh that it just kept on killing speckboom, the unrooted truncheons that were being put into this landscape. However, this site clearly demonstrates that it's not the abiotic factors year on year. Certainly rainfall does have a part to play, but this Mission Impossible slope was planted many, many times, and there are no surviving speckworm anywhere. And that is what happens when you still have herbivores on the landscape, even at low densities. One needs to remember that this whole landscape is the way it is because we had overgrazing for more than a century. In fact, if you look in the distance there, you can see a fence line contrast. Overgrazing on the one side and is intact on the other side. So removing herbivores is a crucial component of thicket restoration. You also need to remember that the succulent thickets of the Eastern Cape didn't have many herbivores in them. You didn't have any sociable mixed feeders in them, so the impala or things that act like goats. So because these closed canopies are very scary environments because predation is very easy, the predators just hang out here and can do ambush hunting. You would have elephants maybe moving through this landscape, but this is a semi-arid region where rainfall is sporadic and you don't have many perennial sources of water, and so elephants would move through this landscape. They'd be nomadic. They'd very rarely be in one spot for any length of time. So part of restoration is removing the impact that caused the degradation in the first place, the driver of that degradation, which is herbivores. And the moment you remove herbivores, you then get successful restoration. So I think that is one of the main lessons that we can learn from this plot, is the value of herbivory exclusion, and that rooted cuttings work even though we had this November 2020 through to May 2021 was a very dry period, and when you have wet periods, unrooted truncheons work very well. But that's a very unpredictable game to play if your restoration is on a schedule. Okay, I think that's enough from me. I hope I've left you with some things to think about and some hope that restoration is impossible even when you think it's mission impossible.